I'm going to talk today on theory and history. Now, a book I'd like to recommend, perhaps surprisingly for the topic theory and history, is the book by von Mises, Theory and History, that came out in 1957. This is one of Mises' four greatest books. Friedrich Hayek thought very highly of this book. He told me that. This is one book he recommended. He thought this would be a good book for people to study. Also, I think you would find helpful the second chapter of Human Action has some very important comments by Mises on theory and history. Now, the first thing I want to discuss is what you no doubt remember from your previous lectures. The Misesian economics is based on the notion of praxeology, a science of human action in which, by deductive reasoning, one arrives at certain theorems about human action, about economics. Now, once these theorems aren't established by historical reasoning, we establish these by thinking about the notion of action, what's involved in the concept of action. But once we do this, then the historian has these theorems that he can apply to various historical problems. Now, in praxeology, one can't deduce historical events. One can't say just by thinking about it, deduce that Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 55 BC. That isn't a theorem of human action. But there are particular results that the praxeologist has established that can be of use to the historian. For example, one you'll remember from, no doubt you've encountered from your reading in previous lectures, the socialist calculation argument. Mises contended that in a socialist society, by which he meant a society in which production was controlled or by a central authority, or all means of production were either owned or controlled by a central authority, economic calculation couldn't take place. By that he meant that if we were to say we had a list of consumers' goods, we had a list of all the different goods we wanted to produce in a modern complex economy, we wouldn't be able to determine what production goods to use that would give us the greatest quantity of the consumer's goods in the amounts, in the ways we most value them. We would want, how would we get the consumer goods in just the way we most wanted them, it would best fulfill our wants. We wouldn't be able to do that without some means of calculating. We would have to say it would be better to produce one good rather than another good. And Mises said we can't do this in the absence of an economic market. He said that only under capitalism can we have such a market. So under a socialism, where you have either government ownership or control of the means of production, we couldn't have economic calculation at all. So a socialist society would inevitably collapse. Now, how can the historian use this theorem? Well, one obvious way to use this is if we take the history of Russia from 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, because what the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, actually in the Western calendar, it's November 1917, but it's called the October Revolution because they were using a different calendar. They were still that time under the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian calendar. But the Soviet Union was a direct attempt to establish a social society. So Mises' argument is clearly relevant there. Now, it isn't relevant in the precise way you might think at first glance. You might say, well, Mises argued the social society is impossible, but we had a social society in existence for quite some years. 1917 through 1989, 1990. So some people have in fact said, well, doesn't this show Mises' argument is wrong? Because Mises says there can't be a socialist society, but we had a very large socialist society. It was one of the second most powerful country in the world for a good many of those years. So this would, if this objection is right, then what the praxeologist has established wouldn't be of use to the historian at all. It would just be come up with a wrong theorem that's been refuted by history. But in fact, this wasn't what Mises was contending. Mises contended only that a worldwide socialist society wouldn't be able to calculate. And of course, the Soviets were able to take advantage of prices on the capitalist market, and not all parts of the economy were socialized. So we have given that the social calculation argument isn't refuted, then we still have to face the question, how can the historian use the calculation argument to try to explain, to help him explain Soviet history? Well, if we know from the calculation argument that socialism won't work, and we extend this, as Mises did, to thinking that attempts to bring about socialism will be inefficient. It isn't that everything is all right in a socialist society until we try to establish a worldwide economy and then it'll collapse. It's that attempts to socialize lead to inefficiency. We can use this in trying to understand particular episodes in Soviet history. For example, when the Soviets first took over, they tried to establish a communist economy by abolishing money. And this didn't work at all, just as the calculation argument would lead us to expect. The goods weren't supplied to the cities at all. All the farmers refused to send in their goods to the cities, and there was almost a complete collapse of the economy. So as a result, under Lenin in 1921, there was so-called new economic policy had to be introduced that allowed the market to return in agriculture and to a lesser extent in industry. And this continued till 1929. Now, then further, when the Soviet economy eventually collapsed, we can see one reason for this. Again, if the calculations argument is correct, then the Soviet economy was bound to collapse at some time or other because the inefficiencies of socialism would bring it down eventually. Mises didn't say this would happen immediately, given that it wasn't a worldwide socialist society, but this was bound to happen sooner or later, in this case quite a bit later. But so again, you see how the historian is applying is acquainted with praxeology, is applying the calculation argument. Now, the historian who's acquainted with praxeology isn't always a matter of just taking the theorem and applying it. There are also difficulties that might come about. For example, a historian might try to say, well, why was it in the period World War II, how were the Soviets able to have such a very strong army that was able to defeat the German army, which was one of the best in the world? The Soviet economic production, contrary to most people's belief, was much in military, in armaments, was much greater than the German. People think it was the other way around, but there was a very good book on this, Burton Klein, Germany's Economic Preparations for War, shows that the German armaments down to the 1930s were much less than people thought they were. Actually, it was the Soviets who had a very much stronger economy. So people who favor this, who want to use praxeology would have to explain what seems to be a counter instance to the view that socialism is inefficient. They might say, well, it doesn't follow that if the economy is inefficient, it's going to be unable to produce anything at all, just that the total allocation of goods won't be efficient, not absolutely every good. Then you see a historian who is not say, socialist historian who doesn't accept Mises' argument would then explain events in a different way. For example, he would say that the Soviet economy encountered difficulties at first, not because socialism is an inefficient system and can't work, but because of, external obstacles, the Russian Civil War of 1920 and 21, where forces backed by Britain and France invaded Russia, trying to restore to overthrow the Bolshevik regime and restore the previous government. And then there was also a war with Poland in 1920. So people who are socialist historians are not sympathetic to praxeology would explain the events in a quite different way. So you see, here's one example of how a praxeologist, knowing praxeology, can help the historian in trying to explain particular historical events. Now, another example is the Industrial Revolution, the great development of capitalism starting in England beginning in the 18th century. Professor Rako mentioned this, I think, in his initial lecture. Many historians contend that, like E.P. Thompson, Making the English Working Class, it was a very influential book, came out, I think, in the 1960s, but he contended that the Industrial Revolution, the onset of capitalism, worsened the condition of the working class. This, of course, is a famous contention of Friedrich Engels in his book, The Condition of the Working Classes in England, 1844, and later Karl Marx in Das Kapital in 1867. They said capitalism has really made conditions very terrible for the workers. It's not a very good system for the workers at all. It's, people have to work in factories under very bad conditions. They work 16-hour days, and women and children have to work in factories. So capitalism is terrible. Now, it isn't a theorem of praxeology that conditions for workers who are under capitalism are always good, where we have some predetermined standard of what goodness is, but we would expect, knowing Misesian economics, we would expect that since the market system, the system of social cooperation in the market, is the most productive system, we would find it unlikely that the onset of capitalism has worsened conditions. It wouldn't be impossible that in particular cases this has happened, but we wouldn't expect it. So the historian informed by praxeology would tend to view the evidence not in the way that Marx and his many followers have done, but in a way that more sympathetic to capitalism. And we find, in fact, that historians influenced by praxeology have done just that. One very good example is Mises himself. Mises has a very interesting discussion of the Industrial Revolution in Human Action. It's, I think, on pages, just a few pages, I think pages of the Scholars Edition, pages 611 through 619, I think. So what Mises contends is that at this period in the world there was a massive population expansion, so that the pre-capitalist system was completely unable to cope with this population expansion. So if it hadn't been for capitalism, these the new people wouldn't have been able to survive at all. So conditions were bad for workers, not because of capitalism, but on the contrary, capitalism was what enabled the people to survive. And he goes on to argue further that even not taking into account the population increase, the condition of the lower classes was very bad, or even worse than under laboring conditions under capitalism in the preceding period. So you see, here again, the praxeologist, is person who knows praxeology, is looking at the historical evidence in a rather different way from the historian who isn't acquainted with praxeology. Since we expect capitalism to be beneficial will tend to be very skeptical of evidence that capitalism has lowered the standard of life of the working classes, will instead try to explain what apparent evidence to that effect in a different way. I should say, in addition to the Mises, there was a book edited by F.A. Hyatt called Capitalism and the Historians, which I think came out in 1954. It has a number of essays critical of the Marxist view of the Industrial Revolution, the condition of the working classes under capitalism. Now, a final illustration I want to give of the use of praxeology of the historian is in the interpretation of the Great Depression in the United States beginning in October 1929. And I want to take here contrast two books. The book, the Austrian book by Murray Rothbard called America's Great Depression, which came out in 1963, which is, Rothbard, of course, was one of the main Austrian economists of the 20th century. His view is the praxeological one, giving the Austrian theory of the business cycle, using that to explain the Great Depression. And to contrast this with the book by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, which also came out in 1963, called A New Monetary History of the United States, a much more influential book than Rothbard's book, in my view, unfortunately. But both of these books have very different accounts of the Depression. Now, you remember from your studies of Austrian theory, according to the Austrian view, if there's an expansion of bank credit by the government, this lowers the monetary rate of interest, the money rate of interest, how much interest you have, say, a businessman would have to pay if he borrows money from a bank to invest, lowers it below the so-called natural rate of interest, which is determined by people's time preference, how much people prefer to receive, how much people prefer the present over the future, what the premium is people will have to pay what premium will have to be offered to people if they're to accept money in the future rather than the present. So according to the Austrian theory, if the interest rate becomes lower, the money interest rate becomes lower than the natural rate, then people who want to invest in higher orders of production, goods that are used to produce other goods further down the line, as it were, sort of heavy industries, other goods that are in, you remember the view of the stage of the production. I'm not going to draw that because I can't draw, but you remember how the system works, I hope. But so people will then invest much more in these higher stages because the money is available to them. But after the monetary expansion has gone on, and when it stops, then it'll be revealed that all these investments weren't justified by the natural rate of interest. People will then revert to their natural rate of interest, and they won't be saving as much. So these new businesses that have been invested won't be able to survive. They won't have sufficient funds. People will shift to spending on consumer industries from spending on the goods of higher orders, and there'll be a collapse of these goods of higher orders. And this, in the Austrian view, is the depression. It's the liquidation of the cycle, the expansion caused by bank credit. So in the Austrian view, which Rothbard holds, there's the depression in 29 was a necessary liquidation of a boom of the 1920s. So to support this, since Rothbard is writing in terms of the Austrian view of the business cycle, this is the theory he accept. He tries to establish in the 1920s that there was a period of bank credit expansion. He stresses, say, that the Federal Reserve policy under Governor Benjamin Strong, who was the governor of the Bank of New York, was trying to inflate the currency in order to, in some sense, one of his motives was to help out the Bank of England, run by his friend, the governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman. So in Rothbard's view, he wants to show, in his view of the Depression, he wants to show there was a monetary expansion in the 1920s, and then he says, well, because of this drove the rate of interest below the natural rate. This accounts for the collapse in 1929. Milton Friedman doesn't hold to the Austrian theory at all. In his view, he explains the depression, he says, by a collapse in the quantity of money. So in 1929, he says, there was just a sudden collapse in the quantity of money. The Federal Reserve System failed to respond to this collapse in the quantity of money, and this led to turn what would be a normal business downturn into a severe depression. So you see how there's a direct contrast here from the Austrian view, which is that the depression came about because of a monetary expansion. With this view of Friedman, no, it was a collapse in the quantity of money that caused the depression. In Rothbard's view, even though he certainly acknowledges there was a sharp decrease in the quantity of money, to him this didn't go far enough because we needed to get the money supply down further in order to liquidate all the bad investment. So you see, here Friedman, who doesn't accept the Austrian theory, has a completely contrasting account of how the depression works with the one found in Rothbard's book. So we see here just one more instance of how knowing praxeology will affect the practice of the historian. Now, I want to turn now to a more general topic, which is I've given so far just on how the historian can use praxeology in helping him to explain various historical events. But I now want to raise a more general question. What is the nature of historical explanation? And here, the Mises view was, again, to some extent based on praxeology, although it isn't part of praxeology, but it is to some extent based on praxeology. Again, once more, the historian can't deduce particular events from praxeology, but what he can do is try to, in Mises' view, is explain particular human actions based on his knowledge of how people act in given circumstances. He thought, in addition to theoretical knowledge that we get sort of from the science of human action, we have an ordinary, everyday knowledge of how human motives work in particular cases. He coined the name, actually took this, see if I can write on this, it's too technological for me. He called it he proposed the name thymology for kind of a discipline of, what have I done here? Sort of a discipline that would enable us to understand human motives. Actually, he took this from the philosopher George Santayana, who didn't use the term in a very favorable way. For Santayana, thymology was intended in a kind of derogatory sense, but Mises didn't take it that way. So what Mises suggests is we could have kind of a common sense psychology that would enable us to understand how particular actors in history had made decisions. Let me give you an example of what he he meant. What he said was, that in trying to reconstruct how a particular actor had made a certain decision, let's take a concrete problem. Suppose we say after in the onset of World War II, after the Munich conference, which was September 29th and 30th, 1938, remember, where Hitler had taken over the Sudetenland, which was the German part of Czechoslovakia, after agreement with Britain, France, and Italy. After that, there'd been a change in British foreign policy. British foreign policy, down to the time of the Munich Conference, had appeased Hitler. They said, well, Hitler has certain demands. We're going to try to satisfy his demands. Maybe he'll then be satisfied. He'll be peaceful. After that, there was a very sharp change in British foreign policy in March 1939, when Hitler took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. So, supposing a historian is trying to explain why did British foreign policy change in March 1939, well, what the historian can do is he'd say, imagine, say, that you were in control of British foreign policy, and you imagine that you know certain facts. For example, Hitler has just taken over the rest of Czechoslovakia, and you have various information on what his previous steps had been, say the takeover of Austria in March 1938, the Munich settlement in September. What would you, and then given, say, that you were aiming to promote British interests, what policy might you adopt? So what you're trying to do, according to this view of historical explanation, is you're trying to imagine yourself in the position of the decision maker. Imagine you had certain motives, certain desires, and certain theories of how people act, certain views of how people act. What would you have done in that instance? So then, say you come up with an answer to that, and then you see how you imagine, say, supposing you were in control of British foreign policy, what would you have done? And then you say, how does what you come up with then correspond to what the people actually did? In fact, we see that in the actual British foreign policy, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, tended to take control over British foreign policy from the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He adopted a much stronger policy of resistance to Hitler than had previously been the case. He issued a guarantee against German attack to the Polish government that eventually led to war when the Germans invaded September 1st, 1939. Britain and France declared war the next couple of days on September 3rd. So you see, what you would be doing here is saying you're trying to figure out how did the particular actors respond to the situation. So you imagine yourself in their position. You say, given that I think they knew certain things and had such and such motives, what would they have done? What would have been the logic of their response? Now, this kind of reasoning, again, isn't something we can do in a purely deductive way. We have to, as it were, think ourselves into the position of whoever the actor is historical actor we're trying to explain. And Mises used the German term verstehen, which is just for this kind of process, which he thought was kind of a process of intuitive understanding, where we grasp what the motives of a historical actor are in concrete circumstances. Now, in coming up with this view of historical explanation, Mises was extending and further developing the ideas of a number of 19th century and early 20th century writers, philosophers who had similar ideas. I want to mention two in particular. Oh, what happened here? This is not what... Yeah. Oh, wait a sec. What do I do here? Here. Everything was working up till now. Can someone give me a hand here? Oh, thanks. Yeah, this is well. I'll have to go on with it. Yes. Is a consumption tax preferable to an income tax? Well, I haven't the slightest idea. I'm sorry. Well, all right. So, oh, good. He's here. Yeah, my stuff isn't coming.
But you broke it.
Oh, I would do that. Thanks very much. Thanks. Okay. Okay, these are two philosophers who were also, they're both philosophers, both of them were historians and philosophers, but it influenced Mises and were especially important in that Mises had very similar ideas in this notion of Verstehen, of this type of historical explanation he was interested in. And what particularly Collingwood, who was a very interesting English philosopher, said all history is the history of thought. And what he contended is that a historian in trying to explain what someone had done in history was really reconstructing the thought of the person he was trying to explain. Say, if, in the example I gave, someone was trying to explain why Lord Halifax had promoted a more aggressive response to Germany, he was really reconstructing Halifax's thought. So he was really having the same thought as Halifax had done if he were correct in his explanation. It wouldn't, of course, be the same act of thought. The historian isn't Halifax himself, but if he's right, his content of his thought is exactly the same as Halifax. If his explanation is the correct one, he's successfully reconstructed the thought. And Mises thought very highly of Collingwood. He said that really Collingwood is the only one of these writers who's fully understood praxeology. The great Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce said in a similar vein, all history is contemporary history. By this he didn't have the absurd view that, say, the events of the Middle Ages are taking place now. What he meant was that when the historian succeeds in rethinking the thoughts of the actions of the past, they've in effect become contemporary thoughts. So by rethinking the what people have done, we've made the historical events contemporary with us. So Mises, I should say, thought very highly of Croce also. He suggested in some of his classroom lectures that Croce was an important, if Croce had gone on to study economics, he would have made important contributions. Croce had done some early work in economics, but then went on to other subjects. All right, so as I say, this is the view that Mises held of historical explanation. That's one that emphasizes this notion of intuitive understanding. Now, this view has to be contrasted with another view which was held by the logical positivists. There's a famous article published by Karl Hempel in 1942, which is called The Problem of General Laws in History. And he said what the historian does is just like the physical scientist. What he's trying to do is explain a particular event by showing how it follows from a general law. What we do in any explanation, any scientific explanation, we have a general law. We have, say, it says if we have such and such initial conditions, something will happen. Then we have, say, these conditions apply, then therefore what we said happened will happen. We explain a particular event by subsuming it under a general law. This is sometimes called the book of W.H. Dre, 1957, Laws and Explanation of History, sometimes called the covering law model of history. It's known in philosophy of science circles as deductive nomological, familiar with the DN model. If you hear people talk about the DN model of explanation, this is what it's referring to. You explain something by showing how it fits under a general law. So you see, this is a completely different account from the Verstehen view that I mentioned that Mises held, because in Mises' view, you don't come up with general laws, you just have a kind of intuitive understanding of what particular people are going to do based on your own, based on various the motives or beliefs you impute to the persons you're trying to understand. Now the positivists objected to Verstehen. They said, well, this isn't a very scientific approach at all. This is just, Mises talking about intuitive understanding. This really doesn't get you anywhere. This might be all right as for a way to come up with a hypothesis, but this doesn't help. This isn't really scientific, because what you have to do to come up with a valid explanation is you can get a hypothesis in any intuitive way you want, but you have to then formulate it as a general law and then see whether the historical documents support the conjectured law explanation that you postulated. Now, I think Mises' reply to this, I think, would be twofold. One is there aren't any such general laws available. There just aren't any general laws of a kind that Hempel assumed existed. There aren't anything close to that. And that further, it's certainly right that you can test an explanation, but to test it, it doesn't permit you to escape from the process of Verstehen, because suppose again, to take my example, suppose you say, well, Halifax decided on a more active policy because he was afraid that Germany was not satisfied with the territorial gains it had already gotten, but would then go on to more further demands on the rest, that would threaten British interests. So then you can test that. You can certainly test this by saying how does it this is verified by the British invasion of Poland. I mean, the British declaration of war against Germany following the German invasion of Poland. But to view this as a verification, you still have to apply Verstehen to that. You have to understand what are the motives behind that. So you can't, if Mises is right, escape from the notion of Verstehen. There isn't some kind of specially scientific process that enables you to get out of the intuitive psychology that Mises has postulated or is used in his own account of historical explanation. So now what I've done so far is what I've discussed so far, the application of praxeology to history and the Mises' Ph.D. and the way he's explained history, have been problems in the philosophy of history, in the sense that they've been concerned with historical explanation, how the historian, so we could call this, if you wanted to be fancy, the epistemology of history, how the historian explains various phenomena, what's involved in explanation. But there's another sense of philosophy of history, which is very different. In this sense, what a philosophy of history refers to, kind of a speculative scheme that's an account of not of what the historian is doing in explaining facts, but it's an account of is there a pattern in history as a whole? Is it, we have, of course, histories of particular countries, history of the United States, history of Russia, have history of particular sciences, or all sorts of particular history, but is there a pattern to history as all of history, something that will explain the whole thing? And most historians today would say no, there isn't, but there are a few philosophers of history who thought there was such a pattern. And I want to mention two of these, Karl Marx and Oswald Spengler. Question: we have to ask, why was Mises in Theory and History concerned with these philosophers? Well, what Mises was always interested in is, I'm sure you've gathered by now, is supporting and defending capitalism, defending the free market. And these philosophies, if they were correct, would in some sense threaten capitalism. They would show, if they were in very different ways, that capitalism was a system that would be applied only to particular periods in history and would be superseded by some other form of social organization. So Mises was very much concerned to show what was wrong with these systems in order so he could pursue his primary goal of defending the free market. So I wanted, in the time remaining, just to go over what his criticisms were of the two philosophies. Probably the section on Marxism is probably the more important of the two, because Marx has been a much more influential figure than Spengler, although Spengler had quite a vogue for a while, especially in the 1920s and 30s, and he was an important theorist of fascism, although his own political views are somewhat hard to pin down. Now, according to the Marxist view of history, as Mises explained it, Marx was here following, in his account of Marx, he was here following an interpretation by the 19th century Russian Marxist Plekhanov. Might as well put him down also, as long as I'm putting down names. Kind of a technological interpretation of Marxism, I think is a very convincing interpretation. The British philosopher G.A. Cohen, in his book Karl Marx's Theory of History Defends, which is the best defense of Marxism I know, also adopts this interpretation. But according to this view, what was basic to Marx's view of history, was a constant tendency in history for technology to develop. Marx called this the forces of production, which basically the technology in society. There's a constant tendency throughout history for technology to get more and more advanced. Say we start off in the Stone Age, and now we go on to the Industrial Revolution, and things keep getting more and more developed in history. So as the force of production developed, at each stage in the development of forces of production, there's a particular social system, Marx called this the relations of production, that is best suited to develop the forces of production. So the relations of production, the social system, has as its function the highest possible development of the forces of production at that time, so that in the ancient world, slavery was the way that would develop force of production the best. In the Middle Ages, the feudal system would best develop force of production. At the time Marx was writing, it was capitalism that would best develop the force of production. He thought there would be a final stage in which socialism would develop the force of production the best, and then after this, this would just continue indefinitely. That was the final system. That was it. So you see why Mises wouldn't like this view, because if it's right, capitalism is going to be superseded by socialism. So Mises developed some, I think, very effective criticisms of the Marxist view. He said, first of all, why does Marx says that there's a constant tendency for the forces of production to develop in history, but he seems to take this as if it's just something that happens automatically, whereas we know that, in fact, the force of production will develop only if particular people want them to develop. Only, remember, it's one of the basic principles of praxeology, only individuals act, so that we can't just take development of force of production as if it's some kind of force operating independently of human action. It's individuals who are acting in history. So the whole basis of the Marxist system, some kind of autonomous development of force of production, collapses if Mises is right. And we have a further problem with the system is, again, we can get this directly from Mises' reasoning in the praxeological approach. We know that capitalism, the free market, is always the most efficient method of social production. It isn't the case that, say, at previous times, slavery was best fitted to develop force of production. At a later time, feudalism, only at a particular period, would capitalism be the best system. Capitalism is always the best system to develop the forces of production. Incidentally, one could, if Marx was right that capitalism is at least for the present, is the way best to develop force of production, we could get a kind of a Marxist argument for capitalism, which would be, you can take what Marx has said, capitalism best develops force of production, at least for the present, and you combine that with the socialist calculation argument that socialism, far from being a more productive system, would lead to complete collapse, and then you would get a Marxist argument for capitalism, which would say that only under capitalism in the indefinite future can the forces of production develop. So you would have, if you accepted Marxist theory, you'd have to accept capitalism. There's one Marxist writer, Meghnad Desai, who has a book called Marx's Revenge, which I reviewed a short while ago, who takes pretty much this line. He says you can get a Marx, according to him, Marx recognized that capitalism might go on for centuries more, and that this would be the correct, according to Marx's theory, that this then would be the correct system for us to have it, because it would be the one that would develop the force of production to the greatest possible extent. Now, a third criticism that Mises made of Marx was one that he said was guilty of what for him was one of the supreme sins. Okay. Do this, right? Oh, good, it worked. Polylogism. Mises liked somewhat unusual words. At least I don't. Even if he didn't like them, he used a good many of them. But polylogism is the view that there are different races or different social classes have different logical ways of thinking. It isn't that we all think all human beings think in the same way. Different groups have different logics. And Marx, to some extent, adopted this view. He thought that there was a proletarian logic which was completely different from bourgeois logic. So Mises was very much opposed to this. You remember in praxeology there are certain categories of human action that apply to all human beings. It isn't just the case that some people from certain social classes use means to achieve ends. It's everyone in action uses means to achieve ends. The praxeology applies universally. So this goes very much against this notion that Marx had. So polylogism then is a fundamental failing of Marxism, according to Mises. Now, polylogism is also, here it becomes an even more important point, the principal criticism that Mises gives of the system of Oswald Spengler. Spengler was famous for his book, which came out right after World War I, called The Decline of the West. And what Spengler contended is that there are various civilizations, cultures, that he distinguished 7 of these. We're now in what he called the Faustian culture. And I'll put this down. And he said each of these cultures, he's rejecting methodological individualism. He said it isn't only individuals act, it's an entire culture acts as a single entity, just like a plant. So like say a culture just grows like a plant. Say it starts off in the springtime and then it'll achieve its highest point in what he calls summertime, and then it fall into decay in the autumn and winter. He thought that although we have these seven separate cultures, each one goes through precisely the same stages as all the others. So what he was extremely good at, he would draw very imaginative parallels between the cultures at various stages of each. And he thought, though, that each culture, again, this is the polylogist part, thought in a completely different way. Say Greek mathematics was completely different from Faustian Western mathematics. He thought the Greeks didn't have the idea of infinity. This was a concept that they couldn't have understood. So he then, applying this to contemporary civilization, he thought that capitalism wouldn't last. It would be replaced by some form of nationalistic socialism. And although he himself, in one of his last books called The Hour of Decision, was rather critical of Hitler, he was also critical of the development of the industrial system, he was very much an opponent of capitalism. So Mises criticizes him just principally on the grounds of that he's endorsing polylogism. He says all the people in these cultures think in completely different ways, and Mises says, no, that's not right. Everyone has the same logic. Mises says, well, if there are these other logic, let's have them formally specified so we can see what they are. And he also criticizes Spengler for methodological holism. Spengler thinks that these cultures are acting as if they're organic units. It isn't just individuals who act, it's the whole culture that is, in his view, quite literally an organism. The culture is like a plant, and Mises, of course, very much repudiates that. So I think I bring this talk to a much-needed end, so I think we have a couple minutes left for any questions, comments, objections. Yeah.
I'm not familiar necessarily with the Fried or the monetarist view of the Depression, but I am familiar with the Mundelean view of the Depression. And so I'm wondering, how do the Austrians view that, which is the idea that since all of the European nations went off the gold standard during World War I, and from 1914 to 1924, the United States was the only country in the world on the gold standard. And so, and the reason that the European nations did this was so that they could engage in deficit finance to pay for the war, which caused a considerable inflation over that 10 years. And then in 1924, when they started going back to it, they went back to it at an undervalued price of gold. They went back to the original price of gold. Now, to me, that seems like that would have a significant economic effect, deflationary effect, and explain a lot of the things that we see in the Depression. Is the Austrian view completely tied to Austrian business cycle theory and the credit expansion, or does it take into account this, this deflation caused by the monetary policies of the European Union?
Well, I think Rothbard does have a paper on that subject. I think I'd have to look that, but I think look that up again. But I think what he contends is that he tries to fit this in with his own account of the 20s. What he says is that the Federal Reserve System, to some extent, inflated the U.S. currency in order to support the deflationary policy of the British. In order to help them preserve the value of the pound they wanted, they inflated the American currency, because otherwise the British policy would have collapsed. So he sees the policies you're referring to as not in disagreement with his explanation, but just as sort of one reason accounting for the U.S., what he views as the U.S. expansion during that period. Kevin?
As I understand what the differences between some of the Austrians and George Mason and a lot of the Austrians here is that they think that praxeology, or the praxeological method, is a kind of hermeneutic, where basically it's merely a mode of interpretation. And I'd be interested to understand, because I think this applies to historical interpretation too. So some people will say that to verstehen praxeological categories is always sort of subjective, merely a mode of interpretation. And I wonder what you would say about that, or if somebody said, oh well, this is just a way of looking at things.
Yeah, well, see, I think what those people are doing, they're confusing historical explanation with the actual science of praxeology. That praxeology claims, if it's right, if it's correct, that it's not just a way of looking at things, but I mean that this is a necessary category of action. Rothbard has some paper on that. I wrote one years ago with the rather perhaps question-begging title, Hermeneutics versus Austrian Economics, and I have a copy. Right, I guess we're out of time now. Thanks very much.